Hello and welcome. For those of you that are new here, we're a faith-based channel. Right now, we're doing a 12-part series, learning more about the disciples and how they helped Jesus. Now, I just want to make one thing clear. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a professional. I don't know a lot of scripture. I don't read my Bible all the time. I'm just a normal guy, a father, a husband. I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to read more. And what I've done here is I've created a presentation, and I've dove in and created a presentation using some tools, image generations, and I created a little story, and I want us all to become better. So let's dive in. This week, we're learning about the disciple.
He was the most hated man in town. Then Jesus showed up. Think about the person at your job that everyone despises, the one who enforces the rules that hurt people, the one who seems to profit while everyone around them suffers, the one who sold out, took the comfortable side, and now does the dirty work for whoever's in charge. Now imagine that person becoming one of the most important figures in human history. That's Matthew. And if his story doesn't mess with your assumptions about who God uses, nothing will. His name was Levi, son of Alphaeus. Most people know him as Matthew, but that name came later. Before any of that, before the gospel that bears his name, before the disciples, before any of it, he was just a tax collector sitting at a booth on the road outside Capernaum. And in first century Judea, that was about the worst thing a Jewish man could be. Let me explain why. The Roman Empire had a system, a brilliant, brutal, efficient system. Instead of building their own tax collection infrastructure in every conquered territory, they auctioned off the rights to collect taxes to local citizens. You bid on a region, you paid Rome up front, and then you went out and collected whatever you could get. Anything above what you owed Rome, you kept. It was a license to extort your own people. And the Romans didn't care how you did it, as long as they got their cut. So, Matthew wasn't just working for Rome, he was working against his own community. Every day he sat at that booth and squeezed money out of fishermen and farmers and merchants who were already struggling under Roman occupation. And he did it legally. He did it with Roman soldiers nearby to back him up. He did it knowing that his neighbors despised him, that his fellow Jews considered him ceremonially unclean, that the religious leaders of his day grouped him in with prostitutes and sinners as people beyond the reach of God's grace. He knew all of that, and he sat in that booth anyway. Why? Because the money was good. Because he'd made a calculation early on that financial security was worth the social cost. Because once you're in that world, once you've crossed that line, it's hard to walk back. Where do you even go? You can't go back to your old community. They hate you. You're not really accepted by the Romans either. You're just useful. You're a tool with a nice house. Have you ever been in a job like that? Not necessarily corrupt, but just soul-crushing, where you know what you're doing doesn't align with who you want to be, but you keep showing up because the alternative seems impossible, because you've got a mortgage, because you've got a lifestyle, because starting over feels more terrifying than staying stuck. That's Matthew at that booth, day after day, the coins piling up, the respect disappearing, the loneliness that money can't fix growing heavier by the year. And then one morning, Jesus walked by. Here's what the Gospel of Matthew says about this moment, and pay attention to how simple it is. Jesus saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And Matthew got up and followed him. That's it. No long conversation, no theological debate, no explanation, just an invitation. And a man who walked away from everything, Think about what Matthew left behind in that moment. Not just a job, a career, a source of income he'd built over years, security, the booth, the records, the contracts, whatever savings he had accumulated from years of collecting. He stood up and walked away from all of it in a single moment. The gospel doesn't record him saying anything, doesn't record hesitation, just he got up and he followed. I've read a lot of commentary on this moment, and most people focus on the miracle of it, the instantaneous nature of the response, and that is remarkable. But what strikes me is what Jesus did right before the invitation. He saw him, he looked at Matthew, not at the booth, not at the ledger, not at the Roman uniform, at the man. Jesus saw past everything that everyone else used to define Matthew, and he looked at the person underneath. You have to understand how radical that was. Nobody looked at Matthew like that. To his Jewish neighbors, he was a traitor and a thief. To Rome, he was a useful extraction tool. Even to himself, I wonder if he'd lost track of who he was beneath all of it. Years of being despised will do that. Years of doing work you know is wrong. Years of hardening yourself to the looks people give you. Years of telling yourself the money makes it worth it. Eventually, you start to believe you are the worst version of yourself. And then someone looks at you and sees something else entirely. Something worth calling. Something worth redeeming. That's what Jesus did. And Matthew stood up. The very next thing Matthew does is throw a party. And this detail is so important, so revealing of who Matthew was underneath that booth. He opens his house, invites everyone he knows, and hosts a massive banquet in honor of Jesus. And who comes? Tax collectors, sinners, the people that polite religious society didn't want at their table, his people, his network, the community he'd built in the margins, among the other outcasts, and the morally compromised, and the ones who'd given up on being acceptable. And the Pharisees, the religious leaders, they see this and they're horrified. They go to the disciples and they say, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus overhears it, and he says something that cuts right through the centuries. "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Notice what he didn't say. He didn't say, "These people are actually fine. You're judging them unfairly." He didn't clean up their reputation or pretend the sin wasn't real. He said, "These are exactly the people I came for. The ones who know they need help. The ones who've stopped pretending they have it together. The ones who've fallen far enough that they can't fake righteousness anymore. There's something freeing about hitting rock bottom, about being so far outside the circle of acceptable that you stop trying to perform." Matthew's friends, these tax collectors and sinners at that dinner table, they knew they were broken. They weren't doing the religious theater. They weren't managing impressions. They were just there, present, hungry. And Jesus sat down with them and ate. Now let me tell you what happened to Matthew after this, because we don't talk about it enough. He became an apostle, one of the 12, the inner circle, the men who walked with Jesus for 3 years, who witnessed the miracles and the teachings and the crucifixion and the resurrection. And then he wrote a gospel, the book of Matthew, the very first book of the New Testament, was written by a former tax collector, by a man who'd spent years extracting money from the poor on behalf of a foreign empire. Think about what it took to write that. Matthew was a trained record keeper. He was meticulous, organized, detail-oriented. He understood systems and documentation, and God used exactly those skills, the skills he developed in his corrupt career, to produce one of the most important documents in human history. The thing that seemed like a liability became the tool. The background that made him an outcast became the preparation for his purpose. This is one of the patterns you see over and over in Scripture. God doesn't waste your history. He redeems it. The years Matthew spent understanding money and record keeping and the mechanics of systems made him uniquely suited to write a structured, legally minded account of Jesus' life. Matthew's gospel is the most organized of the four. It's meticulous. It references the Old Testament more than any other. It documents everything carefully. Because Matthew knew how to document things. That's what he did for years. Just for the wrong people, for the wrong reasons. Your mess is part of your message. I know that sounds like a bumper sticker, but look at Matthew and tell me it isn't true. The very things that disqualified him in everyone's eyes became the foundation of his contribution to the kingdom, the corrupt career, the years of collaboration with Rome, the reputation that made religious people cross to the other side of the street. None of it was wasted. It was all preparation for something he couldn't have imagined sitting at that toll booth. But here's what I want to push back on, because I think we can romanticize this story too easily. Matthew's transformation wasn't painless. It wasn't instant beyond that first moment of decision. Think about what the next days and weeks and months looked like. He's now following this rabbi who the establishment despises. His former Roman colleagues want nothing to do with him. His Jewish neighbors still despise him, even if he's no longer collecting taxes. He's given up his income. He has nothing. And he's in a group of men who are fishermen, who have their own brotherhood, their own language, their own culture. And he's the tax collector, the one everyone knows, sold out. How many nights do you think Matthew lay awake wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake? How many moments did the old life look more stable, more certain, more practical? The fishing boats had fish in them at the end of the day. The tax booth had coins in it at the end of the day. Following a wandering rabbi had what exactly? A sense of something he couldn't quite name. A call that resonated so deep he couldn't ignore it. An encounter with a person who looked at him and saw more than the booth. Sometimes that's all you have when you make the right choice. Not certainty, not a clear path, not financial security or social acceptance. Just the memory of being truly seen. Just the resonance of a call that you can't explain but can't deny. Matthew stood up from that booth on nothing but that, and he walked forward. There's a moment later in Matthew's gospel after the resurrection, after everything has happened, where Jesus appears to the disciples and gives them what we call the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations. And Matthew is in that room, the man who was too unclean to sit at the religious table, the man who was grouped with prostitutes in the taxonomy of sinners. He's standing in that room receiving the most important assignment ever given to human beings. Go tell the world. Go make disciples. Go baptize nations. Matthew, the tax collector, one of the men Jesus entrusted with the entire mission. We don't know much about what happened to Matthew after that. Church tradition says he preached first to the Jewish communities, then went further. To Ethiopia, to Persia. Some traditions say he was martyred. Others say he died peacefully. But what we know for certain is what he left behind. A gospel. A document that has survived 2,000 years, been translated into thousands of languages, has guided billions of people toward faith. Matthew's fingerprints are on more transformed lives than any tax collector in history, because he stood up from the booth. So here's the question. What booth are you sitting at? And I mean that literally. What role have you been playing? What identity have you been wearing? That doesn't fit who you actually are. What career, what reputation, what set of compromises have you settled into? Because the alternative felt too uncertain, too costly, too far from the life you've already built. Because Matthew's story isn't primarily about Jesus' power to transform. It's about a man who was willing to stand up, Jesus showed up. Jesus extended the invitation, but Matthew had to choose to move. The call comes first, then the movement. You can't receive a call and stay seated. You can't say yes and stay in the booth. At some point, if the invitation is real, if the resonance is true, you have to stand up and leave. Leave the coins. Leave the contracts. Leave the Roman soldiers who will back you up. Leave the security you've been clutching and walk towards something that makes no financial sense, but makes complete soul sense. That's what Matthew did. That's what all the great moves of faith look like from the outside. Irrational, reckless, certain only in the way that things felt certain from the inside. 2,000 years later, we know his name. Not as a tax collector, not as a traitor or a collaborator or a sinner, as an apostle, as a gospel writer, as one of the men who changed the world. Matthew, the man Jesus saw when everyone else looked away, the man who stood up from the worst job in Capernaum and walked into his actual purpose. What about you? What's your booth? And who might be walking by today, seeing past everything you've used to define yourself, calling you towards something you can't yet imagine? Because that's how it started for Matthew. Just a man at a booth, just an ordinary Tuesday morning, just someone walking by who looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "Follow me." And he got up. 2,000 years later, we know his name. Not as a tax collector, not as a traitor or a collaborator or a sinner, as an apostle, as a gospel writer, as one of the men who changed the world. Matthew, the man Jesus saw when everyone else looked away, the man who stood up from the worst job in Capernaum and walked into his actual purpose. What about you? What's your booth? And who might be walking by today, seeing past everything you've used to define yourself, calling you towards something you can't yet imagine? Because that's how it started for Matthew. Just a man at a booth, just an ordinary Tuesday morning, just someone walking by who looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "Follow me." And he got up.
All right, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. I know I sure did. If you'd like to stay in touch, we would love that. Head over to IamPhantasma.com and leave us your email. See you next week.